Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the pre-concert chat that we're going to have here this evening before what is a very special evening, of course, for the Toronto Consort, which is the opening of our 45th anniversary season. And I should introduce Jeannette that we'll be hearing from in a few moments, because not only are we doing music tonight, but we're also going to be having some dance elements, which is very exciting for us, because we don't get to do that too often. So I'll just begin by talking a little bit about the music that you're going to be hearing. When we knew that this was our 45th anniversary and that we wanted to start off the year with a kind of Renaissance gala, we thought, well, maybe we should look at some of the favorite pieces that we've done over many years. And as you know, we've recorded quite a bit of Renaissance music over our history, which is great. And so then, but to organize it, instead of just being a kind of favorites or greatest hits, we thought that we would concentrate on four very important courts from Renaissance. And by Renaissance, I'm talking basically 16th century music that you'll be hearing this evening. As you know, the Renaissance was a very important time in European cultural history. There really is a major shift from what we call the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages is maybe too long a period. There were many varieties and subtleties within the Middle Ages. But that being said, there is really a sea change towards the end of the 15th century and throughout the 16th century. It has a lot to do with the importance of humanism and the corresponding less importance of the church as a place for all kinds of culture and for education. The invention of the printing press, as often in our human history, technology drives cultural changes, and with the ability of people to get their hands on books much more easily than they could of manuscripts. And of course this extends to music as well, which is to say that now there were lots of people who could buy music, which before this there were very few, unless you were in a courtly situation and you had a scribe, or of course in the church, who also spent a lot of money copying out their music. But now you would be able to access books of music, and of course there comes a whole new publishing industry of popular music making. And some of that is reflected this evening. Even though we've chosen courts, a lot of the music that you're going to hear was music from the time of these courts and would have been heard at the court, but was also popular music. And of course, in the Middle Ages, we have very little popular music which survives, because the church didn't think it worthy of writing down, and the courts the same. But once again, there was this technology to have it bought by lots of different people, and there was perhaps a business to be made in selling music. Then we do find collections of popular music being published in the 16th century almost for the first time. So for a group like ours, that's very significant, because now we can actually see examples of popular music making, whereas before we only had courtly or sacred music making that was written down. So the four courts that we'll be looking at, I'll go in order. The first one is in France, and it's the King Charles IX. Some of us may know our French king's history. It's not one that's my long suit, partly because there were so many royalty in the middle of the 16th century. Some of you may remember that last year we began our series with a program called The Italian Queen of France, and it was all music related to Catherine de Medici. Catherine de Medici being this daughter of the Florentine Renaissance, a Medici, not a princess, not royalty. They were wealthy, the Medici, but they weren't royalty. And there were lots of people who thought this was a rather unusual match, that Catherine de Medici should marry Francis I, a very important French king at the beginning of the century, his second son. They sort of got away with it in a way, because being the second son, he was never expected to become king. He had an older brother, but his older brother died before his father did, so then Catherine's husband became the next in line to become king and queen of France. And indeed, that's what happened. And then her husband, Henry II, died rather too young, actually following a wound that he suffered in a tournament, one of these jousting tournaments, and he sickened, probably gangrene, and died. And so she was left with a number of young children, but she was, of course, now the queen mother, and many of her children didn't enjoy good health. The first son who inherited lasted only about 2 years, not even 2 years on the throne. And then came Charles IX. He was quite young when he became king, but he was very influenced by Catherine de' Medici. And of course, the Italian courts is really, in a way, where a lot of the most innovative practices, cultural practices in music and in dance and in literature and so on, first occur, is in Italy. So she was responsible for introducing a number of very important aspects of European cultural history into Renaissance France. That being said, these innovations would have traveled there sometime for sure, and the French were always interested in what was going on in Italy, but it didn't hurt that she was there and she could choose some of her favorite artists to come to her court. So for instance, she and her children were responsible for some of the first Commedia dell'arte performances in France, this brand new Italian theatrical tradition. She was the first to introduce into France what we call the violin band. Violins altogether were a very new Italian invention, and they were a wonderful instrument. They're still reign in the orchestral world today. The violin family is still perhaps the top of the heap in a way, but these were just being developed at the early 16th century by Italian instrument makers, and she insisted that she have a whole band of them come and entertain her for her dances. And she also felt dancing was a very important part of courtly life, and that led to the preeminence of the French in the dance world. As Jeannette could tell you, every important French ballet term is a French term, and that actually goes right back to the 16th century that the French seized on this aspect, and it's partly through the influence of Catherine de' Medici. Well, one of her sons, of course, was Charles IX, and he was very musical, and so we decided to focus on him. He had as his organist a man named Guillaume Cotelet, so there's a couple of pieces by Guillaume Cotelet there. We're going to do in this section a number of dance pieces, one of which will be danced, as you will see. Both the pieces that we're going to do there come from a collection that Michael Pretorius, that of our Pretorius Christmas Vespers fame, put together. Now, Michael Pretorius is a German Lutheran composer, but he put together a collection of French dance tunes. So we think, well, why was he putting together French dance tunes? Well, it so happens that one of the people that Catherine de' Medici said, I want to come to my court, was a very talented Italian violinist. And he had the name Nadini when he was born. He was from Cremona, which is where a lot of violin making was happening. And he came and played in the violin bands at Catherine's court. He changed his name to Carubel, to give it a much Frencher name. And then later in the century, he left the French court and he went to Germany, and that's where he encountered Pretorius, who then wrote down a number of these French dance tunes. And again, we're very glad because they were published. It's interesting because the violinists who played these dances, they learned them all by ear. And it was quite the thing. It was like a guild of these players, and they prized the ability to know these melodies. You couldn't just find them and play them yourself, because this was part of what their guild was about, and that they had this almost ownership over these melodies and their arrangements. In any case, I don't know whether Carubel was breaking union rules by sharing them with this German Lutheran, but he did, and we're glad he did, because then Michael Pretorius published them. So although the publication of some of these dances is much later, we know that they came from the time of Catherine de' Medici and Charles IX. The second court we're going to visit needs the least introduction, I dare say, which is that of Elizabeth I of England. All of the pieces that you'll hear have something to do with Elizabeth. We begin with a wonderful ballad A ballad being a popular tune which was used to set a variety of texts. There were many ballad tunes in late 16th century, early 17th century England. The most famous ballad tune that we still know today is called Greensleeves. We all know that tune, dum bum 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 ba dum bum bum bum. Some of us may know that the original words are about My Lady Greensleeves, hence the name. But as you know, it's also been used to sing Christmas carols to it. What child is this? Or the old year now is passed away. There's a New Year's carol to it as well. That shows you just how these tunes were often used. There was a beautiful tune, someone wrote words to them. Now, not just Christmas carols were written to these tunes, but things to sort of tell you the news of the day. So what this ballad about the Earl of Essex is, it takes a tune and sets verses about this man, Robert Devereux, who was the Earl of Essex. As you know, Elizabeth I famously never married, not for want of suitors. All sorts of people would have liked to be connected with England, perhaps at the time. She even had envoys sent from Russia, if you can believe it. Ivan the Terrible. If they'd gotten married, I think European history might have been very different than we have today, but they didn't. She didn't marry any of the French suitors. She didn't marry some of the English suitors. So people ask, well, did she ever really fall in love? And there are a couple of possible candidates, one of whom was quite late in her life, this Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, who was a dashing general and led some very wonderful campaigns, but he did some things that he shouldn't have. He disobeyed her orders, he got too intimate with her, familiar with her, and he, for a variety of quite legitimate reasons, was tried and convicted of treason, which was guilty of losing your life. And so he was executed. And so this ballad shows how popular he was amongst the general populace, because it talks very sympathetically about the Earl of Essex, as if this was not a good thing to have happened, even though it followed the letter of the law quite strictly. The other piece that's on in that set is called Can She Excuse? And we think those words might have even been written by the Earl of Essex. It's a complaint by a lover saying, why doesn't my beloved listen to me more? That's a very common trope amongst love songs. But in this case, it talks about, I'm not a base suitor. And the tune itself has been called in other sources the Earl of Essex Galliard. So we think that he probably wrote the text and got his name associated with the melody. So then we get to the second half, where we go to Albrecht V of Bavaria. Well, we're not exactly scraping the bottom of the barrel, but it's not nearly as important a court, of course, as the court of the royalty of France or the royalty of England. But we chose that because Albrecht V was a very cultured man, and he had the good fortune of hiring, when he was young, a composer named Orlando di Lasso, or Roland de Lassus, he's sometimes called, or Orlando Lassus, who was from northern France, Belgium, what was called Franco-Flanders. And so French was probably his native tongue, although he must have spoken Flemish as well. He then spent quite a bit of time in Italy and learned a great deal about Italian music making. And then he was hired by Albrecht V and went to the court in Munich, where there was this dukedom of Bavaria. As you probably know, this was not Germany like we think of Germany today. There were many very small principalities dotted around the 16th century map. Some of them had the privilege of being electors to the Holy Roman Emperor, so that was a little more important. But it was quite broken up. And some of these principalities by the end of the 16th century were Catholic, and some of them were Protestant, and so on. And it wasn't like we think of Germany as a country today at all. And so Bavaria was an important, but actually quite small in terms of geographical area compared to the territory that Charles IX could say, this is my kingdom, was much, much smaller than that. But Orlando di Lasso became the most important composer in Europe in the next 20 years after he got hired. There are over 500 publications of his in about a 20-year period, and people everywhere just wanted to hear his music. He really was a superstar. Part of it was because he wrote in many different genres. He wrote French chansons, he wrote songs in Italian because he spent enough time in Italy to know Italian repertoire very well. He wrote, of course, in Latin, but not just church music in Latin. He wrote sort of texts which were taken from Virgil and from moralistic poems written in Latin, all kinds of things that he wrote. And he was wooed, shall we say, by Charles IX. Actually, Charles IX adored Orlando di Lasso and hoped that he would come to his court. To no avail. Lasso loved his life in Munich. He became quite wealthy towards the end of his life, and he just settled in, and that's where he stayed. So we really wanted to pay a visit to Albrecht and pay him the respect of understanding what a talented composer he had in his court. Last, but certainly not least, in fact, in some ways, perhaps the most important, is Isabella d'Este, who was the Marchioness of Mantua. Italy is the same as Germany at this time, many small states. But it's in some of these small states that we really get, early in the 16th century, really interesting experiments in music and in painting and in literature that becomes the Renaissance. And she was one of the leading lights of that. And there was developing, and she definitely patronized and encouraged, a way of writing music, without getting too technical, very different from the medieval way of writing music. In the Middle Ages, you had a one line, and then sometimes that line was pre-existent, meaning it was a bit of plain song. And then you added another line on top of it to make a polyphonic, and then you added another third line perhaps, or a fourth line. But it was conceived very linearly. It wasn't made up of harmonies, which kind of go, when I speak of a harmony, it's like there's a bass note and there's a chord which goes with it. It's a kind of vertical way of thinking of music. And it means that the bass line becomes much more important because the bass line is sort of the key to the harmonies. And there was this genre of music called the frottala, which is the first examples in Western music of this harmonic thinking of music. Of course, the Middle Ages had rules about what sounds could sound together, but they didn't think of chords in the same way. And really, we think of chords, not every kind of music, but from then on, the chords can be more and more complicated when you get to Wagner and so on. But it's still often the harmonies are what sort of is the inner workings of the music. So, and she was there when these frottala were appearing, and she encouraged them, and we'll give you some examples of them this evening. The reason music is so important is partly because there was a real belief at this time in the Renaissance that the world was full of harmonic spheres. We talk about the harmony of the spheres. And that therefore music must in some ways bring us closer to this which is the Creator's will, that the spheres should be in harmony. So of course, music demonstrates that, and if you understand music, probably you're aligned with the harmony of the spheres, and therefore you will actually be a better person. Even morally, you can't help but be better if you align yourselves with the harmony of the spheres. The other way that one aligns oneself with the harmony of the spheres is through dance. Because dancing at the time, too, was full of beautiful patterns. And this is where I'd love to ask Jeannette. First of all, Jeannette, maybe you should tell us a little bit. I think many of us know you through your work with Opera Atelier, and which is operas which are Baroque and classical and even romantic operas Opera Atelier has done. But maybe some people don't know that you also have training in Renaissance dance.
Well, when Marcel, my co-artistic director, and I founded Opera Atelier, we thought it was very important to know what came before the Baroque and what came after, as well as knowing the Baroque itself. So I attended the Early Dance Institute in Baltimore, Maryland for 4 sessions and learned quite a bit of Renaissance dance as well as Baroque and early 19th century ballet. I studied with wonderful Ingrid Brainard. She was an expert in the 15th century Burgundian style, and Charles Garth, who is the 16th century master, galliards, pavans, that sort of thing.
So, as some of you will know, we had a wonderful experience last year. Jeannette and Marshall run a wonderful school of atelier ballet, and they have some very beginner students, and then they gradually get some very accomplished young dancers in the school. So we approached them and said, could they learn some Renaissance dance? And so that's how it worked last year, and it was such a hit with many of us. We thought we must bring them back and even feature them twice in the evening, which we'll be doing this evening. So I chose a couple of pieces that fit with these courts that we wanted to do. So I chose a suite of brawls for the French court, and then when we, in the second half with the Isabella d'Este, I chose some dances from that time. One is called a pavana, or pavan, like we have in English, and a piva. So Jeannette, when I gave you the music, how did you go about deciding how to choreograph them?
Well, as usual, I always listen to the music as an inspiration for any of the choreography that I do, but I also went to the texts, of course. I went to the orchesography by Arbeau for the brawls, and in fact you're going to see some things that are pretty much straight out of the orchesography, as well as some slightly more creative on my part, but staying within the style brawls, because there are about 6 brawls in this suite. So the orchesography by Arbeau, first published in 1589.
And what is it exactly? When you say it's a text, what do you mean it sits?
He describes the dances. He has sort of a conversation with a student in the book, describes the dances verbally, and then he made a very simple type of notation where the music runs along the side, and he has verbal descriptions of the steps. The steps were quite simple, so that it was not difficult. The notation for the Baroque is much, much more complex.
Now, and who would have danced these dances? Is this like going to see the National Ballet or anything like that? Or who were the dancers, if you know what I mean?
Theatrical dancing was just emerging. Catherine de' Medici was one of the main people to bring this to France and to Europe in general. But the performers were aristocrats. There were no professional dancers at the time. That doesn't mean they weren't good, though. Like the students you're going to see, they studied rigorously with a dancing master right through the Renaissance and the Baroque. The professional dancer emerged sort of in the 1650s. So this is long before the professional dancer. And it was the courtly amateurs that danced beautifully in most of the court performances. Brawls, of course, were also done by the common people. They could be done in a field, they could be done anywhere. They were danced by rich and poor.
Aha. And so when you say this, that obviously you chose a French dancing treatise to help you with a brawl, which is a French form. What about, are there Italian dancing treatises too that you could help with a piva and pavana?
Yes, there's one very great Italian dancing master called Domenico of Ferrara, and his pupil, Antonio Cornazzona, wrote a book called The Art of Dancing, and it's got a lot of information about pivas, bassa danza, which is also within the piva, and the other dances that were done in Italy, and the pavan, of course, and the galliard.
And can I ask how, I mean, I think probably for your students, were these new steps, even if they are, you know, fairly straightforward, maybe by dance levels, how did they react to learning these new steps?
Well, the students, these are very advanced students. They're trained ballet dancers. So again, they're like those courtly amateurs. They're well trained, and in fact, a lot of the training is still similar in the beautiful posture, the 5 positions of the feet. What they had to get used to was not turning out quite so much. They certainly are allowed to jump as high as they like, and they have to be very, very musical, which this group is. That's something we really stress in our training. They found that they had to be a little bit simpler in the way they moved, and not quite so stylized, I think, a little bit more natural.
Well, it's fascinating to think about these elegant courtiers as I may have mentioned, there's, or I certainly in the program note, another Mantuan, where Isabella d'Este lived most of her life, was Baldassare Castiglione, who wrote a very important book called, in Italian, Il Cortegiano, or The Courtier. And in it, he describes the education and the morals and the proper behavior of a true courtier. And dance is definitely one of them, and as is music. Although it's very interesting, you mustn't almost get too good, because a sure sign of poor breeding is conceit or showing off. One must not show off when one is elegant. And they have this wonderful Italian word, sprezzatura, which has often been translated as grace or elegance, but it's almost a kind of nonchalance, I think, that you just know how to behave, you know how to hold your body, you know how to enjoy a song, you might even know how to sing a song beautifully, but you're not doing it, and you're certainly not doing it for money. So you don't learn so much that one would think that you were a professional at all. Anyway, it's been delightful to work with these students. I've just had the high sign from our stage manager. We just have a couple of minutes, and I always do like to just see if there's any questions that any of you have in the last little bit that you would like to ask Jeannette or me. Is there anything that you would like to, what you wonder about this evening's performance or how we put it together?
Yes,
the question is, sorry, I'll just, sometimes the question is, does Jeannette do recitals that maybe one could enjoy some of this in another situation?
We have a wonderful recital every year at the Royal Ontario Museum on Family Day. That's February 19th this year. It sold out so quickly last year, many children of course, that we're doing 2 this year, 1:30 and 3. And we're doing dances from the Renaissance through the Baroque, right into the 19th century ballet, including point work and social dancing. And we'll have both sung and danced excerpts from our upcoming production of Monteverdi's Return of Ulysses.
So there's your Family Day activity if you'd like. Anything else? Yes?
How long does it take to get this production together with rehearsals? It's got to be a few weeks.
How long did it take to get together with rehearsals? Well, as often happens, the dancers will work away. So I provided Jeannette with CD versions or tapes so that she could go to work, and I'm sure you listen to them many times and think about it and check with Arbo and so on, and then come up with something. So when did you start working with the dancers?
I started working with the dancers in September, and we tried to have the dances finished by after about 5 or 6 weeks. So it was 5 or 6 weeks of work.
And then this week was just this week that we got together to put the live musicians with, but we try and make sure that our tempos and feeling is similar to what we have provided the dancers with, so that they're not too surprised. But it is live theater then, so some nights, it might be a tiny bit different. And of course, from the musical point of view, the rest of the evening with all the concert music, some of it we know, but mostly we work a good solid week starting on Monday, but as professional musicians we just work all day, Monday, all day Tuesday, that kind of thing. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy this evening. As you know at this point, yes, thank you. At this point, we have a little shuffling around when you take your assigned seat, and people may be coming into your seat. So enjoy the evening. Thank you.